Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Pardon us for the technical error there. We'd like to welcome you to this evening's presentation, sponsored by Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy, Canadiens pour une politique climatique raisonnable. We'll just flip through these slides and give you an idea of the new report that's out there. So I'm going to walk through fairly quickly because there are some important events coming up this evening that some people will want to be part of. So Canadians have lots of questions on net zero and climate policies, and Canada has a quest to be a climate leader. We've made a net zero 2050 commitment, and recent federal legislation has been imposed without cost-benefit analysis or due diligence. So we've got the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, and that was part of the Budget Implementation Act, so it wasn't fully debated in the House of Commons. We've got the Canadian government adopting the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which is Bill C-12, and that happened on November 19th, 2020. So that effectively defined what had previously become law by default. So there hasn't been very much public discussion on any of these very important laws. And many people are a bit foggy on what net zero means. Net zero is referring to carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is a component of greenhouse gases that's released from fossil fuel use and from human activity. And the idea is that this must be removed or stopped to stop global warming and prevent extreme weather. That's the theory. Carbon taxes and carbon trading markets are then presented as a means to offset the continued use of fossil fuels while applying emissions limits or caps on certain industries. So industries that emit below their cap, or services that provide a carbon sink, such as newly protected old growth forests, can then sell their excess to capped industries until that industry has time to implement its own net zero technology. But to make all this viable, a price on carbon has to be established. And why? Because the tax creates a penalty to the large emitter, which forces them into carbon trading, and it offers a financial benefit to the low emitter. So you might want to know what's the past progress on emissions reductions. So almost 30 years ago, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, was established. And at that time, the rate of temperature rise and the rate of carbon dioxide emissions from human industrial activity appeared to have been moving in lockstep since the 1970s. So the UNFCCC was formed to have unified global action, to enact national policies which would create a stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that was the assumption at the time, but recall that was about 30 years ago. And the main greenhouse gas seen as the problem was carbon dioxide, and that's referred to as carbon today. And the main source of it was seen as industrial activity and the burning of fossil fuels. 30 years and 25 COP, that's Conference of the Parties, meetings later, emissions continue to rise. And you can see that very well on this chart. And here's the names of all of the events: the Rio Conference, Berlin, Geneva, Kyoto, yada, right up to lockdown. And even in lockdown, there is no emissions reduction visible there. So let's have a look at some climate history here. Here's 4,540 years of global temperature cycles. And you can see that naturally we go from warming to cooling, to warming, to cooling, to warming, to cooling, warming and cooling, and then warming and a bit of cooling, and then warming again. And you can see that this is really much on a par with natural warming that's happened in the past. So if you examine this graph closely, you can see that societies did rise and fall depending on whether temperatures were warm and moderate, or they fell when it was cold and difficult. Lots of famines in these times. And you can also see there's lots of volcanic activity in these cold times. So today, the largest emitters on the human causation side are China, USA, the European Union, 28 of the EU countries, and India. Now you can see that China's emissions here in the red are by far the largest of any of the nations. Next is the United States, and you can see that they've actually come down quite a bit. Then the EU 28, they've dropped quite a bit, mostly because a lot of industry moved offshore. Plus, they have a special accounting for East Germany, which is another topic. Then you can see that India is actually rising quite rapidly. That's kind of the orange one down here near the bottom. Russia and Japan. And you can also see that international shipping and aviation, we're always told, oh, that's a huge portion of emissions, but it's actually nothing compared to China. What about Canada? Well, let's compare. China emits in 1 month about 819 megatons per month, about what Canada emits in 1.5 years. 1.5 years. So if Canada was completely wiped off the map, it would make no difference to global emissions. So Canada has also got very conflicting goals on climate and immigration. So climate activists are constantly denouncing Canada for missing targets, while simultaneously calling for climate justice for the people of the world, especially immigrants. And yet Canada's fertility rate is only 1.4 children per female, which is below the replacement level. Immigrants from tropical or temperate low per capita emissions countries like China, India, and the Philippines become high per capita emission citizens when they move here, because of course here they need more energy to stay alive. So according to the World Bank, per capita CO2 emissions in Canada have been about 15 and 16 tons, but Canada has embarked on the Century Initiative to add another 63 million people to our population. Now, if you look at this graph, you can see that Canada's emissions have been pretty much a flat line for almost 30 years. But in that time, the population increase was 37%. So overall, I'd say that we've done quite well. So Canada net zero by 2050, are you sure? Let's have a good look at this graph, because this shows the total energy supply by source in Canada from 1990 to 2019. It's from the International Energy Agency. You can see that we're using coal. It's a declining factor, but it's still large. Natural gas is growing. Nuclear is pretty stable. Hydro is pretty stable. Biofuels and waste, that would be wood and such like, that's pretty stable. Oil has increased slightly, and you can hardly see any line on this graph for wind and solar. So you have to think that net zero means phasing out all coal, natural gas, and oil and replacing it within 29 years with electrification, supposedly by wind and solar or hydrogen, geothermal, or tidal power, none of which are market ready or have suitable infrastructure. You have to remember that past transitions from from wood to coal, coal to natural gas, have taken 70 to 100 years each. Wind and solar are ancient technologies, and they were abandoned in favor of high density oil, gas, and coal. So, and they're also all made from oil, gas, and coal. So can the world achieve net zero by 2050? We've just seen that Canada cannot, but let's have a look at this graph. You can just get a sense that fossil fuel consumption has gone up 57% in the time of climate diplomacy. And this gives you some detail on what we'd have to build to replace this million tons of oil equivalent energy. It's a crazy amount. Robert Lyman has written this report, Why Renewable Energy Cannot Replace Fossil Fuels by 2050. Great report. and an excerpt here. To produce the number of panels required, it would take 929 years, assuming they could be built at the rate of 1 per second. The estimated cost of this is US $15.93 trillion. And just in case you don't know what $1 trillion looks like, here's a million in packets of 10,000 of $100 bills, 100 million, 1 billion, and here's 1 trillion. So we're talking about 16 of these. That's a pretty big debt load. Some social and economic factors. Will the Paris Climate Accord work? As we've seen in the graph about China and the other emitters, the world's largest emitters are the developing nations. They're interested in moving their people forward. It's only the OECD countries who seem intent on committing economic suicide. And if you look at these graphs here, these pie charts, you can see that these are the kinds of reductions that are being proposed, and the end result will be a Great Depression, huge unemployment in Canada. So the net zero goal is not possible with any current or on the horizon technology unless Canadians sacrifice their social and economic well-being. And will decarbonizing stop climate change? Well, first of all, let's ask ourselves, can electricity replace fossil fuels? You have to remember that electricity is a secondary energy source. It's made from something, usually from fossil fuels. And so there are no technologies that can easily replace fossil fuels and create reliable, affordable energy. And to try and convert heating, cooking, transportation, and industrial systems from fossil fuels to electricity would be a truly enormous investment by homeowners, businesses, and taxpayers. Now, hydrogen can play a niche role, but we'll talk about that a little later. It's a very unreliable and dangerous substance, very difficult to handle. And can we succeed in fighting climate change? Well, as we showed before, there are unpredictable natural factors, and there seem to be a number of cycles. So Earth's climate has been changing for millions of years, and it will continue to change even if we stop burning fossil fuels. But what we can do, and we know we can do it because we've done it every day, we can adapt to extreme weather. So, think of some of the common things we have, like central heating, central lighting, paved roads, insulated houses. Those are all adaptations that make it possible for us to live comfortably in Canada. Should activists or realists lead the way? Should we let climate activists hijack capitalism? Well, there's no reason to think that a bunch of unelected bureaucrats can design and build and operate our present and future energy systems, especially because, as you can see, many of the proposals they've made are not in the realm of reality. And so there's some conclusions about the economic and social factors, and we've shown that the aspirational slogans like Net Zero 2050 are simply impossible in the time frame proposed and very unlikely to have technology to suit it. So we need more open civil debate on these matters. Another thing that seems to be forgotten is that when the UNFCCC was formed 30 years ago, our understanding of climate was very different than today. Climate models, and here's a kind of a conceptual illustration of it, are computer simulations that are used to project future temperatures, and climate policies, like carbon taxes, are set based on these models. But these are like mathematical models, and that's actually not how the world works, because as the IPCC itself said, in climate research and modeling, we should recognize we're dealing with a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. And they said that way back in 2001, and that is still true. And just to give you a sense of what a coupled nonlinear chaotic system looks like, here's something that Henri Masson put together for the Porto Climate Conference in 2018. And you can see that all of these factors are affecting each other in different ways and creating very dynamic, unpredictable kind of outcome. And carbon dioxide from human emissions would be one little part of the atmospheric composition. So you can see there are many, many factors affecting climate. It's highly unlikely that using carbon dioxide as the control knob would change the climate. Let's review the climate science. Can carbon taxes control weather? Well, no, because fossil fuel is essential in modern society, so it's inelastic. A carbon tax driven price increase does not reduce consumption. And as I showed you, carbon dioxide is just a tiny part of a very complex system. Is climate science settled and no further debate necessary? Well, people probably don't know how much climate scientists with dissenting views are shut out of the media. And recent research reveals most alarmist peer-reviewed climate studies rely on a completely implausible emission scenario and outdated science. But of course, the media blocks out anything. This is an example of Columbia Journalism Review. They're running the Covering Climate Now project. 400 media outlets reaching 2 billion people report only on climate catastrophe themes. And carbon dioxide levels are actually low. So this is something that we should be concerned about, because if the level of carbon dioxide were to fall below 150 parts per million, which is only 38% of present day, all terrestrial plants would die and we would follow soon after. And how about net zero policies? Are they scientific or not? Well, carbon dioxide, is it causing extreme weather events and rising sea levels? While there are credible theoretical and observational studies showing that CO2 emissions from human industry have contributed to a slight warming of the planet since the mid-1980s, there's no credible link between those emissions and extreme weather or rising sea levels. And this should tell you why. This is the basis point for saying that temperatures have risen in the past 100, 150 years. Obviously, there is no complete equidistant temperature monitoring basis from which to go by. So actually, the climate emergency is over and we do have time. And why do I say that? Because first of all, there's been a lack of scientific rigor. A recent study shows the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that issues the climate Bibles, as they're called, that governments set policy according to what they think they read there, that they didn't properly account for the total solar irradiance effect on northern hemisphere temperatures. And the mandate of the IPCC is to assess human-caused climate change. So of course, natural factors like solar influence are given short shrift in their reports. Dr. Richard Lindzen, one of the world's most foremost climatologists, points out that assigning CO2 the lead role in climate change creates an oversimplified picture of a complex system. And the sensible environmentalist Patrick Moore, great guy, co-founder of Greenpeace and now outspoken advocate for common sense on climate and energy policies, he says that the biggest danger is actually running out of CO2, as I noted just previously. So these implausible scenarios are driving the climate emergency claims. And if you look at this graph here, you can see there's this thing called the RCP 8.5. This is where the climate emergency came from. And recent research by Roger Pielke Jr. and Justin Ritchie has shown that most of the most influential academic papers are using this scenario as their point of departure, when in fact it turns out that we probably reached peak carbon around here. So this is a completely implausible scenario. So if this is the next worst case scenario, that's not so bad. And it's probably more likely that we're here. But in fact, the people who made these scenarios never meant for them to be used for policy making. They're not meant to be used as choices like, oh, if we do this, then we'll end up with that, or oh, if we do that, then we'll end up with this. They're intended to only study climate science. They're not intended to set policy, and they've been improperly used. So let's have a look at some of the proposed clean tech. Hydrogen is very popular as it's touted as the replacement for fossil fuels, for natural, it's going to replace natural gas and gasoline, even jet fuel. Again, what's the problem with this? Hydrogen is quite abundant in the universe, but it's the world's smallest molecule and it has to be captured. It has to be made in some way. So it can be produced through electrolysis, and many people think that that could be then powered by wind and solar, and then it would create this kind of almost perpetual motion type of production of hydrogen, and the hydrogen would become a battery, if you like, for the wind and solar energy. But that's unproven at any great scale, and there's repetitive energy losses. And worse than that, the most common element on Earth, hydrogen, readily leaks from containment vessels. It's highly explosive. Even in leaking, the static electricity generated by a leak can cause it to explode. And the blast range is that of a football field. And it's very difficult to handle because it either has to be compressed, and that takes a lot of energy, or it has to be cooled, and that takes a lot of energy. So you're leading to 30 to 70% energy losses all the time, and that's not sustainable for a modern industrialized society. Some people say, well, electric vehicles are the cure. But are they? First of all, EV penetration in North America is nominal. Only 3% of Canada's light vehicle sales and only 2% in the US. And will continue to be so, largely due to vast distances, extreme weather conditions, and the fact there's no infrastructure. In Canada, other than hybrid vehicles, battery electric vehicles face challenges of vast distances, limited network of chargers, and temperature extremes, which really reduce performance. And, you have to plug an electric vehicle into something. So you need a power generation plant, and an energy conversion analysis found we'd need to build 10,000 more megawatts of additional power, and that would be the equivalent of 8 to 10 Site C or Muskrat Fall dams. Now those are both way behind, years behind in completion, billions of dollars over budget. And just to build one such project, you need a time frame of 20 to 30 years, and there's not even one new major power generation project on the table in Canada. So we'd be talking to build 8 to 10, and that would only be to serve the electric vehicle, the proposed electric vehicle market. So how about an east-west power grid? That's a lot of people's solution. Well, in addition to power plants, the related infrastructure like high voltage transmission lines, large custom-built substation transformers, and related integration technologies would be required. And remember, these demands are being made at the time when many other countries in the world are also trying to go to net zero. So the cost of all those things will go up. The mined materials for all of this would be unbelievable. There are a number of reports that the demand for some of these minerals would skyrocket 2,500% and such like. So all of the costs would also rise. And land acquisition for rights of way for high voltage power lines can take decades. And likewise, in terms of public resistance, the only thing that activists hate more than pipelines is power lines. So we have 3 reports here by Robert Lyman, which I hope you'll have a look at, because really EVs, they're cool cars and everything, but they basically rely on subsidies. And the poor end up subsidizing the rich. So have a look and see how that happens. How about removing carbon dioxide? So there's 2 different methods that are proposed: carbon capture and storage and direct air carbon capture. So carbon capture and storage, we do have some successes in that in Alberta and also at Boundary Dam. So it's not that it doesn't exist or that it doesn't work. It does, but at what scale? After 20 years of planning and subsidies, the carbon capture and storage facilities in the world stored just 0.1% of global CO2 emissions. And it looks like there's a bit of a cottage industry here in writing academic papers about carbon capture, but in the actual implementation is much more difficult and not quite as easy as people think. And you can read in this report by Robert Lyman, which is Speed Bumps on the Road to Decarbonization, you can read about this Princeton CCS proposal for the United States. How about direct air carbon capture? This is kind of the principle of having a large kind of vacuum cleaner suck carbon dioxide out of the air. Well, in this one method, electrolysis is required, and it uses caustic soda. But to make the caustic soda, it would consume 25 to 40% of world's electricity, and to regenerate it so you could just reuse it, that would claim another 11 to 17% of global primary energy. So if you add all those together, the requirement would be 15 to 24% of global primary energy to capture 25% of CO2 emissions. So of course we'd also be generating more emissions there. And the last nail in the coffin is that it appears to be 6 to 10 times in terms of energy needs, appear to be 6 to 10 times higher than traditional CCS energy estimates. And that process, as we've shown you, is stuck in neutral. So how about electrifying industrial processes? And we've just seen recently that ArcelorMittal Dofasco in Ontario, they just got a big $400 million grant from the government to make steel with electricity. But again, the central issue is cost. First of all, that project is being subsidized by taxpayers. And secondly, the industries that do not rely primarily on process heat use 2.5 times as much energy as the ones that do. So JP Morgan estimates that in addition to upfront switching costs, meaning switching over all of your equipment in your factory, industrial companies would face costs per unit that are 3 to 6 times higher for electricity than for natural gas. And again, I want to remind everybody, if we're talking about decarbonizing everything and turning to electricity, so this industrial operation would be demanding more electricity at the same time you at your house would be demanding more, the same time the downtown buildings would be demanding more, and on and so on. So you can imagine that prices would super skyrocket. And most companies in the OECD nations, if they're forced to assume those kinds of costs and they don't get to be subsidized, then they just move their operations overseas. And here you can see more detail on the comparison of the different industries. This will be posted on the blog with the report that we're referring to, so you can have a look at it and click on the links at a later time. Sorry, I'm kind of rushing through here. I just want to make sure that everybody is able to hear the material and then go on with their evening. So Canada is a climate leader with no followers. Net zero 2050 is not possible. And here's an excerpt of one of Robert Lyman's reports, Promises versus Performance. This is from 2019. It's a table that shows the 10 largest emitters. You can see that in the decade from 2008 to 2018, China's emissions grew 28%. The USA dropped 9%. European Union dropped 16%, in part because it became so expensive there that Tajani, who was the Minister of Industry in the EU in 2013, called it an industrial massacre. So India's emissions went up 69%. Russia dropped 0.2%. South Korea dropped, Japan dropped 10%. South Korea went up 25%. Saudi Arabia up 25%. Oh, sorry, that was Iran up 30%. Saudi Arabia up 35%. Canada up, wow, 1, just 1. I think we did pretty well. And so now we see, as COP26 approaches in November, all the countries who were part of it were supposed to submit new updated emissions targets. They missed the deadline. And then more recently, China told US envoy, the climate czar, John Kerry, that it'll just follow its own climate roadmap. Thank you very much. Smack in the face. So, as I've shown you before, Canada's emissions are 1.6% of the world's emissions. They are nothing, and if we didn't exist, there'd be no climate change. But probably this is the most important piece of information that you can have. The global reality is that emerging nations will not sacrifice future growth. And look at these population demographics. North America is 5% of the world. Europe is 10. So 15% here. Now, Africa has emerging nations. The Asia Pacific region has huge emerging nations like China and India. They make up 60% of the world's population. So do you really think that they care what the climate-addled West is saying about climate change? The only reason they're in here for a free ride is because the West has offered them $100 billion a year from the Green Climate Fund, which is going to come from your pocket and will have no accountability whatsoever. So that's the only reason these developing and emerging nations jumped into the Paris Accord. They were bribed. And if you look over here, world energy consumption is rising. But why? It's because of the non-OECD countries. All these emerging nations, they want to have a good life for their people, and they're just not going to listen to us. So this is an excellent report by Robert Lyman, When Giants Arise, and I think it really makes a clear case about, what kind of suicide we're doing to ourselves. And for no benefit. It's not like we're going to benefit the climate or the environment. So the premise of the report is that a Made in Canada proposal should be put forward for a prudent way forward. So net zero is a global plan, but I just want to have you look at this map for a minute. Look, this is Europe overlaid on Canada. So Canada is 2.3 times as big as the European Union. So these countries are small, highly populated, they're very well networked with transportation routes and power lines and interties. And we just don't have that in Canada. We have this huge, vast country. So we cannot take climate policies that work in like Denmark and apply them to Canada. So as shown, there's no reasonable cost-benefit analysis that's been done, no actuarial loss assessment, no probability analysis. These plans have been put forward by environmental non-governmental groups, ENGOs. They're very ideological people. They probably have a lot of goodwill and intent, but it's just not realistic. But they're a very powerful lobby group in Ottawa. And ordinary citizens are not. We don't have that same opportunity to speak to the politicians as individuals that these very well-networked and well-coordinated environmental groups do have. And unfortunately, the plans that they're proposing will turn citizens' lives upside down for no benefit to the climate, the environment, or any economy. And it's clear that reducing carbon dioxide will not stop climate change, and it may even harm life itself. So really, we have to look at Canada. We are the luckiest people in the world. It's a nation rich in resources and potential. Net zero 2050 climate policies will destroy us. So Canada has unique challenges. As we've done for decades, we must adapt to climate and weather events. And we need to actually start doing smart planning, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely plans, rather than coming up with this crazy ideology of net zero that, is impossible to achieve by 2050 and maybe never. So Professor Ross McKittrick has outlined an interesting means of assessing climate mitigation measures that would be triggered by a temperature change, and you can find a reference to that in the report. And this is the report that I'm speaking of. It's called Fighting Climate Change: Can We Humans Regulate Earth's Climate? It discusses in more depth all the things that I just brought to your attention, and it's sponsored by Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy, Canadiens pour une politique climatique raisonnable. So I hope you will have a look at that. And one closing note, we're very pleased to announce that we have an upcoming event, our 18th annual climate science event. It will be online this year due to COVID, and we're going to welcome Dr. Ruud Burkhout, the president of Clintel. He'll be speaking to us from Holland live, so it's slated for 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, October the 2nd. And his climate topic will be Climate Science, Let the Data Speak. And then on October the 6th at 7 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, we'll have Mark Morano from the States. He's an author and he's also a climate activist, but he's an activist for realism. He'll be talking about Green New Deal, the Great Regret. And the overall theme of our event is that politicians can't stop climate change. So I hope that you will tune in for that event. And if you like the work that we do, please consider joining us or giving us a donation. We are a volunteer-run nonprofit society. We operate on about $150,000 a year from our member subscribers, and we're very grateful for their support, but we are operating well below the financial and economic power of the big ENGOs. So I'd like to thank you all for tuning in tonight. I hope that you have a good evening and an interesting one, and that this has offered you some enlightenment. And we'd be happy to have you join us to donate. Please subscribe, like, or put your comments in. We like to hear from you. And we look forward to our next events. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good evening, and God bless. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. Good night.